Hello and welcome to HealthTech Hour on UK Health Radio. My name is Steve Roest, and each week we bring you the best news, views and interviews with CEOs, leaders and clinicians who are driving the health tech revolution in the UK and beyond. I'm a CEO and founder of a health tech company myself, and I am passionate about the people and companies who are changing the world. Before I introduce today's guests, I want to remind everyone to follow us on the socials. It's at HealthTech Hour. And please also follow the station, which is at UK Health Radio, to stay on top of all of the great content that's coming up. Today sees us return to the area of mental health, specifically in the workplace. So our guest today is Dr. Nick Taylor, the CEO and founder of Unmind, which is one of the largest workplace mental health providers in the world. Unmind aims to change the way organizations think about mental health, and they have offices in the US, the UK, and Australia. It's available to over 350,000 workers and counting, and they have some of the largest brands in the world who are using their services, like British Airways, John Lewis, and Just Eat. Unmind service has never been more important as we emerge from the pandemic, and they recently released a survey of employers which found that 65% of employers believe that mental health issues relating to COVID would negatively impact their business in the next 12 months. Mental health issues, in the same report, it said mental health issues are also the largest cause of absenteeism in workplaces. So for both employees and employers, Unmind is performing a hugely critical role. And as anyone listening to the show knows, I'm a huge supporter of services designed to support mental health. I'm a huge believer in spending time looking after mental health through whatever means is necessary. And so I'm really excited to get Nick on the show and ask him some questions. So Nick, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you for having me on the show today.
Great. How has Unmind fared during the pandemic? What has the mood been like in the camp? Because I know that you've grown phenomenally over the last 12 to 18 months. And so, but yeah, how has it been?
It's been probably in some ways similar to what others have felt, and maybe in some ways a little bit different. When the pandemic first hit, I think like all organizations, we were deeply concerned by what the implications would be as an organization. And then from a professional perspective, in terms of what we do, we were deeply concerned by what was going on from the perspective of mental health. And what became apparent over the first kind of period when we were getting used to this COVID world was that actually, far from organizations saying, we've got to button down the hatches, cut all spend, and just get through this crisis, organizations took a different view, which was now more than ever, we need to be investing in the well-being of our employees because of the unprecedented pressure they're going to be under. And as you can imagine, therefore, Unmind has been exceptionally busy over this period as we have supported more and more companies to empower their employees to take proactive care of their mental health.
Well, there's a lot that we're going to get into. So as anyone listening to the show will know, we do it in three parts. The first is sort of an origins part, where you came from and how you've got to be doing what you're doing now. The middle part is all of the amazing stuff that you're doing now with Unmind to change the world. And then the final part is around what's next, either for Unmind or more just in general. So how long had you been working in the NHS before you came up with the idea for Unmind?
So I think if I go back a little bit before then, even I've more or less always been interested in the topic of mental health, or at least as long as I can remember. I grew up with three sisters, and my middle sister Jessica is Down syndrome, and for Catherine, Anna, my other two sisters, and I growing up with Jessica, we were aware from a very young age that people could be different and be treated differently by the society around them. And I think Jessica really impacted my interest in what does it mean to be human, and what are the defining characteristics of that experience. Fast forward about 20 or so years, and I did my undergrad degree in classical music and was a volunteer with the Samaritans, which I found really rewarding, as I think many people do who do that voluntary work. When I graduated, I started working for the mental health charity Mind as a support worker in Herefordshire, working with people with severe and enduring mental illnesses such as Korsakoff syndrome, schizophrenia, bipolar, and people who required 24/7 care because the severity of their mental ill health is so significant that they require support workers with them all of the time. And it was during that experience that I was supervised by a clinical psychologist. And And it was the clinical psychologist named Peter who helped us as support workers know how to better support the people we were working with. And he inspired me to go back to university, do a degree in psychology and a doctorate in clinical psychology before then going into the National Health Service. And I was in the NHS for all of that experience of being an assistant psychologist, being a clinical psychology doctoral training psychologist, and then being a qualified clinical psychologist. So that whole period is about 6 years, and then also became a visiting lecturer at organisations like University College London and the Institute of Psychiatry, teaching doctoral and undergrad students in mental health. So there was quite a long period in which I was professionally working before leaving to co-found Unmind.
And what within that period of time did you focus on anything particular, particularly in those 6 years where you were working? Well, you were moving through to full qualification. Did you focus on any particular areas of mental health?
So one of the defining characteristics of clinical psychology training is that clinical psychology as a profession takes a lifespan approach. So you have to understand the human experience as changing across periods of your life. So clinical psychologists are always taught to and trained to support people from birth to death. Okay. So I've worked across services from very young children in hospital through to older adult services as well. I was always fascinated by the work in learning disabilities because obviously growing up with Jessica as a sister, it was a topic I was very passionate about. How can you bring equality to people with learning intellectual disabilities, support them to live fulfilling and whole lives in society.
Okay. And at what point did you come up with the idea for Unmind, and sort of how did that, not necessarily when it was fixed, but these things generally come, they're sort of cumulative. Well, that's in my experience, is sort of certain things happen over a period of time, they accumulate, and then suddenly you sort of think, oh my goodness, there might actually be something in this. And then at that point, it might be an epiphany, or there might be some other external sort of motivation that pushes you to go and do that. But what was that kind of accumulation period? Is that what happened with you, or was it slightly different?
No, I think that's about right. So it was I guess a couple of things, and as I imagine you might be able to relate to this. There are lots of little events that ultimately give you those aha moments. But I guess that from a clinical perspective, there were things happening, and then from a leader perspective in the NHS, there were things happening in my mind as well. Now I'll start with the latter. So as a senior psychologist in the team, I was part of a management team responsible for supervising a team of people in our NHS service, and I witnessed firsthand the impact that the workplace was having on the well-being of our staff, and felt ill-equipped as a manager to adequately support our employees to manage their mental health, and particularly to manage it proactively. So I firsthand saw the impact that mental illness had on absenteeism, presenteeism, and staff turnover, and also in culture building and hiring great people. But then from a clinical perspective, I guess two things frustrated me. The first was that, sadly, to this day, I can tell you, I have never met anyone at the right time on their journey towards mental ill health. Okay. I've only ever sat down as a therapist and thought, I wish I'd met this person 6 months or 9 months or 12 months or 18 months before, when the problem really started. But I've never done that. And what that speaks to really is the fact that when it comes to accessing treatment for mental health problems, very rarely, if ever, do people get the right care at the right time. And that's a massive problem, because what we know across all health provision is that right care at the right time results in the right health outcome. Yeah. So if you miss that timing piece, you miss the opportunity to provide the most valuable care. And that's obviously very frustrating for health systems, because then you're operating inefficiently, but even more frustrating for the person who's not getting the right care at the right time.
Well, and particularly within mental health, if that's mistimed, then the consequences can be very, very severe, very, very serious. If that person then if that intervention doesn't happen at the right time, and that person may then deteriorate for various reasons.
That's right, and I think that's absolutely right. And actually, mental health is on the spectrum, and you move steadily down or up that spectrum depending on what's going on in your life. But all of our focus historically has been on the bottom end of the spectrum, so reactive healthcare. And the final frustration for me was that we don't focus on prevention. And it doesn't make sense to me why we don't. We're so good at prevention in other areas of healthcare. We teach I've got 3 young children, and we teach them with very limited success in my experience about the age of 1 to brush their teeth.
Right.
And that's because we know prevention is better than cure. We know intuitively in dental health that's the case. In physical health, even in the height of lockdown, we were able to go running for an hour a day because we know prevention is so important to good health. But with mental health, it's been a bit in the dark ages, and all our focus has been on reactive care, and that really frustrates me.
And is that because without wishing to take a slight tangent, but I'm a big believer in therapy, and I've been seeing a clinical psychologist off and on for a number of years for various things, and she's fantastic. So her and I often have varying sort of conversations about things, and one of her issues or beliefs is exactly the same as what you're saying, and her view is that whether I don't know whether you believe this or not, but that there's been a huge amount of focus within clinical psychology, within research around problems, and not necessarily as much research around sort of positivity. So it's all around treating conditions that have happened, as opposed to preventing things happening in the first place. But I don't know whether
that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. I mean, I think clinical psychologists are trained to study the problem set more than they are trained to study and understand the preventative side. But that speaks to how the healthcare system trains and operates its people. So the real aha moment for me was I went down to South Africa with my family, and I bumped into by chance an old friend of mine or current friend of mine, but I hadn't seen for a long time. I'd known him for a long time. And I said, "What are you doing at the moment?" He said, "I'm working with a guy who runs mindfulness courses in Johannesburg for corporates." Okay. And at that moment, it was like, okay, that's what I want to do. I want to take this idea of preventative mental health into the workplace, because organizations are so well positioned to bring about this change in mindset around mental health. They're so well positioned because they've got this captive audience of people who they can empower to behave in particular ways. And that was when I made the decision to leave.
And is there also something in it because of the way that I don't know about how mental health provision works in any other country, I must confess, and I don't know a huge amount about it in the UK, but it seems like in the UK, you might have to have a sort of a diagnosis almost before you go and see someone, or some kind of referral. And is that why that ends up being too far down the chain? Whereas actually within a workplace, you have those people there, like you say, all of the time effectively. So you're more able to move up the timeline, so to speak, more towards the preventative end.
Yeah, I think maybe that's part of it. And the diagnostic system that we have, i.e. like clinical depression, anxiety, that system is so helpful to understand people's presentations, but also incredibly helpful because it protects and safeguards limited resource of reactive services. There are only so many psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health nurses, social workers to meet the enormous need within society, and therefore you have to have some sort of arbitrary cutoff. Safeguard the services, right? So what we do is we wait for people to get to a level of unwellness, and then they can access that care. That's fine, and that's a good system given all the resources that we have, but it's not the perfect system. We don't just get mental health when we get unwell. We have mental health from the moment we're born to the moment we die. It's literally with us the entire time, and every human being on earth right now has mental health. Every human being who has ever existed has had mental health for their entire life. So far from being a topic that you should think about for the, say, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people who have got a mental ill health problem, it's a topic we should think about with the 5 in 5, because we all have it all of the time. So that then leads to well, how do you do that? And what does that really mean? And that's why digital is so important in this topic, because there aren't enough psychologists. So you can't rely on them. There aren't enough coaches, you can't rely on them. You have to leverage digital to scale up.
And also you need digital to provide that service at a cost that's acceptable to the person that's going to receive that. So in the case of, well, you obviously do it through an employer, so I guess it's free to the employees, but it needs to be at a cost level that means it can be scaled. Otherwise it just won't go anywhere.
Exactly. That's exactly right. It's a bit like toothbrushes, and dental health is a brilliant thing to compare.
That's the second comparison. So
because it's so obvious when you start comparing it, you're like, oh, that makes sense. If you compare, the cost of root canal treatment, that is thousands of pounds because it's complicated, to the cost of buying a toothbrush, and a pack of toothpaste. It's much cheaper, much simpler, and much more scalable. You don't need a dentist with you every time you brush your teeth.
Nope. No, you don't.
No. So think about that in relation to mental health. You don't need a psychologist with you every time you're working on your mental health.
No, and actually, I would imagine in a way that, well, for like you say, the 5 and 5, that might be somewhat off-putting to be to be only able to engage with your mental health if you were actually sat down with a psychologist. That would be burdensome, I would suggest.
I think so, but you know, coming back to you, I mean, on this one, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because as a community now of healthcare health startups, there is this really wonderful trend towards prevention and towards understanding problems much earlier, which I know is something you're very passionate about, and that's so exciting, because I think there is an opportunity with innovation to shift the way in which societies think about what great healthcare should look like.
Yeah, digital health provision, digital health services make prevention a reality, really, because it allows the services to be provided scalably, and it means that those services can be delivered directly to the people that actually need them in a way that they will actually use them, as opposed to, in our world where PocDoc is focused on allowing people to give themselves a cardiovascular disease risk assessment just using their smartphone and our tests, and we're looking at diabetes and a number of other things. It's no longer enough to just put a poster up in the doctor's surgery and sort of say, eat healthy, and similarly, there are huge cohorts of people that need to be reached that are at risk. And there are nice pathways and things like that about how to reach them. But if you're not able to do that digitally, then there's a huge limit to that. So that's what and as you say, prevention, if you can get prevention right, then it has huge benefits, not just for the individual, obviously, but also at a macro level for the healthcare system.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right.
Reductions in cost, we can reallocate resources to things that, where prevention doesn't necessarily help, like quite a lot of cancer and things like that. So makes so much sense.
But you know that the complicated thing about mental health is just how complicated people's minds are.
Well, each mind is different. It's completely unique by definition.
That's right. So we at Unmind, we talk about mental health as a whole person topic. So you've got to think about some of these mental health as being their psychological life. So that's their personality type. That's their core beliefs about the world. That's how do they interpret the world around them.
Yeah.
Then you think about it from their social, their social perspective, which is how do they, what's their workplace, what's their home life, what's their finances, what's their family network, what's their friend network. Mm-hmm. And then you think about it from a physical perspective, which is, what is their age, their gender, their disease status, how well do they sleep, what's their nutrition, what's their exercise fitness. All of these things uniquely put us on the mental health spectrum. And each of those, that in the healthcare language, that's the biopsychosocial model I've just described, we each are uniquely informed by our biopsychosocial reality.
Biopsychosocial reality.
Biopsychosocial reality, which is just the reality of living, just the reality of your life as defined by your biological physical life, as defined by your social life, as defined by your psychological your psychological life. So it's those three things together. But human beings are complicated. We think about the meaning of life. We think about purpose. We think about meaning. These are really complicated topics, and our interpretation of our circumstance, our interpretation of our own life, our understanding of our life informs our emotional health. So it is really complicated.
It's fluid as well.
And it's fluid. And it's a topic that we've grappled with forever.
Yeah.
If you look at the world's religions, if you look at ancient Greek philosophy, if you look at what the arts have been doing, it's trying to explain and describe the human experience. So much of what they are doing, particularly if you go back to Greek philosophy, that is about so much of that period of philosophy is about well-being. Like how do you live a good life?
Are we talking about Stoicism, like Zeno of Citium and Seneca and Epictetus and all that chap, all those guys?
That's amazing the way you just rolled those off the tongue. Exactly.
I'm a huge believer in that as well. In that philosophy but you're right. It's a way. Humans have always been trying to find it almost like a filter to understand the world and understand their experience in the world.
and that informs our emotional well-being. But that's where the dental analogy breaks down, because fundamentally our brains are more complicated than our teeth. But and it's a bit like, I'm not a great car person, but I imagine if you, and I've never had the luxury of owning a very high performance car, mine have been at the other end of the spectrum, but I imagine if you own a very high performance car, it's wonderful to drive, but it also requires an awful lot of care and attention. And what human beings are gifted with is a brain, which is the performance car of the animal kingdom. And therefore we've got to manage and maintain it well. And if we're making time to brush our teeth, if we're making time to run, we've got to make time to look after our brains.
Yeah, I'm with you on the car analogy. I have 3 small children, so I drive a Seat Alhambra, minivan from 2011 or something. So I take the point. So just to go back to your kind of epiphany moment when you're in South Africa, you heard about the mindfulness courses at corporations, and you thought, aha, how did you? Because it's still quite a big leap from mindfulness courses at corporations to what Unmind is today, which is this global digital workplace mental health platform. So how did that kind of move happen? Because you could have very easily gone down a route of just being a one-man band doing mindfulness courses at corporations.
Yeah, it was always something that frustrated me as a clinician. So I'd sit in a therapy room and I would say something to somebody which seemingly would have a big impact on that person.
Okay.
Like in a way they would interpret it or whatever, the information, or they go, oh, I wish I'd known that before. And I used to think to myself, why don't people know that before?
Yep.
Because actually from a psychological perspective, that's not very complicated. And it used to kind of it used to fill me with a bit of anxiety, if I'm honest. The notion of spending the rest of my career saying the same thing to individual people, the scalability of that is simply like how many people can get in a room over the course of my professional life. And that felt unsatisfying. So I was like, how do we get that information scaled? So the ambition for me was always like, how do we scale up this information? It shouldn't be necessary to train somebody for, let's say the average clinical psychologist trains for maybe 7 years. To train someone for 7 years to give a piece of information to somebody after a 9-month waiting list, which fundamentally is really basic, that's not a very good model.
No, so that's not scalable.
That's not scalable. So how do you create that scalability where you leverage digital? So digital for me was always key to this. Like we could leverage it. So that
was in the plan from day dot.
From day one. So day dot. So workplace was always in the plan, because that was where the frustration was for me as a manager. And I saw the opportunity there. Digital was there from day one. I'm deeply passionate about the science. So there's a good reason that mental philosophy emerged into psychology and it became a science, because the scientific method works really well for creating evidence, which is valuable for all sorts of reasons you will know, and listeners will know. So I was always deeply passionate about the content being scientific and the measurement being scientific. Or maybe come on to measurement later.
I know that's a big thing for you. You made a few statements, which is what's measured is managed, which I know is one of Unmind's kind of big ethoses.
That's right. And then the final piece was prevention. So those were the 4 pillars that we had. And as it happened, one of the guys working with this person running the mindfulness sessions in South Africa was one of the lead content creators for those programs, called Steve Peralta. He went on to become one of my co-founders of the business, and he had also articulated the same problem. He's actually a wellness coach, so he had trained and qualified on the other end of the spectrum to me. To brought all that wealth of knowledge with him, and he now leads all the content creation on the platform, works with leading authors, academics, and clinicians around the world to create the content for us. And then we needed a technical co-founder, so we found a technical co-founder to join on board, and then a co-founder who had taken the journey before building startups and also knew the HR benefit space. So we built this kind of core team to begin with. And one of my very best friends had recently scaled up a venture capital business selling mattresses, and I'd been aware through kind of casual conversations of how the venture capital world works. And so I had even though I had no training or background in this topic, I had a framework, at least a a semblance of an understanding of how this kind of works to raise money to build platforms and things.
Yeah.
But looking back from where we stand today to where we were then, I mean, it was there was so much we didn't know.
Okay.
So it's been an interesting journey, but we built that core team, and that allowed us to then kickstart it.
That makes
5 years ago.
And so, how did you? What was the process that you went through of coming up with the content? So the reason I ask is that we've had we haven't had a specific. Well, we had Kate Newhouse, who's CEO of Kooth. We also, and they're focused on young adult mental health services provided by local authorities. They also do some adult stuff, but it's majority under 18, I believe, or under 25s. And then we've also had one of the founders of an app called Smoke Free on. And so the reason I'm interested in the content and how you've come up with the content is because the provision of content digitally is partly about the actual content, and then there's partly about how you communicate that content, whether it's just static content, whether it's part of some kind of engagement, whether there's, notifications or challenges or goals, or, and both of those things are really, really important, and they have to work together. So what was that kind of like to begin with? Because you could have very easily just put together a very static program that had all of the really great content in it, but that might not necessarily have had the right impact.
I always thought that if you consider within the NHS or most healthcare systems, if not all, to provide gold standard care, you need a multidisciplinary team.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that each member of the healthcare professions has a different lens by which they interpret the patient or the client or the person you're working with. So a medical doctor will think about it differently to a nutritionist, to a psychiatrist, to a social worker, etc. So we used to talk when we founded Unmind, and this principle still maintained, it's true today. We needed a multidisciplinary team 2.0. So you need your clinicians, you need your academics, but you also need your product developers, you also need your designers, you also need your copywriters. The reality is we live in a Netflix age, and people need content to be engaging. I mean, we all need content to be engaging. Sitting through a boring video, I still have memories of, it ages me a bit, but watching my chemistry teacher struggling to get a VHS to play, and then you watch this kind of crackly old video of somebody trying to explain something, and it's so boring. It's unbelievable. We can't do that anymore. And mental health has been so limited in budget and engulfed by stigma for such a long time that it's behind the curve. When you compare the way mental health things are positioned to physical or dental health, particularly in prevention, it's chalk and cheese, or at least was over the last few years ago. What I mean, like if you buy a pack of Colgate toothpaste, it's beautifully presented, it's wonderful. If you go into Nike Town, it's such an amazing experience, right? Isn't it wonderful? And everything looks perfect and beautiful. Mental health needs to keep up with the Joneses here a little bit. We need to make sure that we are, as a professional group, positioning this topic in a world-class way, because it is really a wonderfully exciting topic, but it just needs to be carefully presented. So back to your original question, we were passionate about the branding of what we were doing. Like I think today, even if you Google mental health, you'll get a black and white image of someone holding their head in their hands. And I've met many people as a clinician. I've never met anyone in black and white, so I don't know at what point we thought that characterized the topic well. But so we need to move away from that and position it in a more aspirational way, because aspirational things motivate people. And that, so we need to be more motivational in the way we position mental health topics. But we've done so much learning over the last 5 years about how to do it well, and it's surprisingly difficult to create content that is engaging for 5 minutes.
Well, that's why I asked, because I think that people, well, I say people generalize, but people we're a digital health platform combination of a test chip and an app that does a risk assessment. So we grapple with these things as well. And it's actually really, really hard to try and figure out the right user interface, the right user experience. And we're not necessarily trying to do it in anywhere like as interactive as your service is, because we're providing people with a very limited set of information. It's not necessarily so much of a back and forwards with ours, but I think it must be really hard. That's sort of why I asked, because the right content displayed in the wrong way won't have the right impact. if that makes sense.
100%. I used to go into Foyle's bookshop in London and stand in the wellness section. And
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever done that, but in the mental health section.
Is that Foyle's? Is that the one in Soho? Is that where's
that's right. Yeah.
Tottenham Court Road or wherever. Yeah.
That's it. It's Charing Cross or Tottenham. Yeah,
Okay.
round exactly. And you stand there and you're just surrounded by thousands of books. And I used to stand there and think, I bet all of these books are brilliant in their own way.
Yeah.
But who's got time to read them? And how do we live in such a busy world?
Yep.
And I've also got 3 young children. I'm lucky if I've got time to have a bowl of cereal in the morning. We can't say to people, read the books, because people don't have the time. So you've got to condense information, make sure it's scientifically really brilliant, but using language that's engaging. Because again, you can't just use you've got to adapt things to work in a practical world. No matter, you could do the best randomized controlled trial in the world, but if it's not in a comparable real world environment, it's useless.
Yeah, agreed.
So you've got to create something that will work in the real world.
When especially
that's the art.
And is there an element where we'll get onto exactly, because I'd really like you to take me through the walk me through how Unmind works from an employee perspective. But just one more question before we do that, because you're focusing on workplaces, is there even more sensitivity that you have to display around the trade-off between people using your app and the fact that they need to work, if that makes sense? Like is there a discussion that happens, obviously, because you can't. Do you see what I'm sort of getting at? Because you can't. If I was an employer, I would want my employees to be healthy and to use the app, but I wouldn't want them sat there on the app all day, because the app is so addictive. They just are on the app all the time. But I don't know.
We were always quite passionate about not trying to create kind of the social media of mental health. That's never been our ambition.
Right.
And I don't think that. If you totally cracked it from a product perspective, you would ever even get to a place where people used it all day, every day, obsessively, right? I don't think even people do that with Instagram or Facebook. But we have not seen a reluctance or an anxiety from employers about empowering their employees to look after their mental health using the Unmind platform. Awesome. We've seen a huge appetite for it, and we've seen, particularly in the UK, which I think is one of the world's most progressive countries when it comes to preventative mental health care, such an incredible acceptance of the model or understanding of the premise from the offset without a huge need for descriptions. And that has changed over, if you compare the market today to 5 years ago, there's a very big difference. And I think we're seeing that now repeated throughout the world. Yeah. Australia is another great example of a country that's very progressive when it comes to preventative mental health care. And these countries that are, I think you put Canada in the same bucket, tend to have a more holistic healthcare system and a less medicalized psychiatric system. Because if you have a highly medicalized psychiatric system, the default language is diagnostic. Yeah. And the limitation of diagnostic language is it doesn't lend itself well to preventative approaches.
No, because it kind of excludes all those people that don't get to that, that don't quite get to the diagnostic threshold.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about, coming back to your earlier point about clinical psychologists maybe not being well qualified in prevention, I think you could probably say the same about medics, right? It's about health, but in terms of medics are qualified and wonderful at working with problems. It's not their default position to focus on prevention.
Yeah, that makes sense. So walk me through, as an employee, what happens when my company signs up to Unmind?
So when you sign up to the platform as a company, our client success team then work very closely with the organization to plan a launch of Unmind. And we'll often try and tie that around a particular thing that's going on in the company. It might be a wellness week, it might be an all hands type meeting. And we will plan that, but then we'll launch it and inform all the employees in the organization. They now have free access to the Unmind platform, and so to they can gift a free license to their loved one as well.
Oh, that's nice.
Really important. Coming back to that social idea of our mental health, it's informed by our loved ones as much as it is by us. And then they'll be invited to either access the platform on a web-enabled device or download the app, either as iOS or Android, onto their phones and create an account. And there are different ways you can create an account based on how the organization is structured and operates. But they create an account, and then they come into the platform. The first thing people are invited to do is to do an assessment called the Unmind Index. And that's an assessment that we have built in-house. And we've collaborated with some incredible people at organizations such as UCL and University of Cambridge to create the Unmind Index. And the reason we built our own one was that when you look at the typical assessment, ways to assess mental health in the diagnostic world, there are measures like the PHQ-9 for depression, the GAD-7 for anxiety, and they're such good clinical tools, but they are designed to diagnose or help in the diagnosis of clinical depression or a form of anxiety. They're not fundamentally designed to be used with a well population. And when we looked at the current measures already in existence, what we found was that the most amount of work had gone into quality of life tools in preventative mental health. And quality of life is not a construct that sits well within the medical framework. So you end up with essentially a different paradigm you're working into the healthcare system, and that's jarring. So we wanted to create an assessment tool that gave people insight into how their mental health is without asking them negative questions. The PHQ-9 will ask questions that are quite negatively skewed because it's clearly looking for depressive symptoms.
Like what? What's a negatively skewed question, roughly?
Well, have you had thoughts of harming or killing yourself? Would be that, which is not an appropriate question to ask a well person that just wants to maintain their mental health.
And
it's quite off-putting.
In a workplace context, I can see questions like that as the first interaction with the service are going to be a little bit kind of.
And then straight away you delete the app. Exactly. So we created our own tool that still had that same level of clinical validity, but it gives people insight into how they're doing across that biological, psychological, and social parts of their mental health based on their unique scores in things like happiness, coping, calmness, fulfillment, sleep. They're then signposted to content on the platform that's going to be most helpful to them based on the idea of the right care at the right time. And that content is delivered either as tools which you can use on an ad hoc basis. So for example, tools to help you fall asleep, tools to help you focus, tools to help you relax, or learning and development programs, which we call series, which are typically between about 3 days and a couple of weeks to complete, delivered in bite-sized chunks of video, audio, and interactive elements. All of the content draws, loosely speaking, on cognitive behavioral therapy and its various iterations, neuroscience, positive psychology, mindfulness, those type of topics. And we create that content with world-leading authors, academics, and clinicians. So the people that, when you go into Foyle's bookshop, you look at all those wonderful books, they're the people we work with to create the content on the platform. And we measure the effectiveness of those programs, those series programs I'm talking about. So we can demonstrate the efficacy of them as well. And you can complete those throughout the day. They take no more than a couple of minutes to complete. I'm doing one today at the moment. I did my session on earlier today about mindfulness for stress, which we collaborated with a Buddhist monk called Choden to create, which is incredible and really teaching me so much actually about how to apply mindfulness on a day-to-day basis, really valuable. So that's the content on the platform. But then also there's a social component where you can send praise to loved ones or to colleagues or to friends for behaviors that are known to be good for mental health. So collaboration, humor, trust, things like that. And then also we will bring together all of the services available to an employee within their organization or geography, so they can also access those if they need additional support. Because obviously Unmind is a preventative tool. We'll also signpost to your reactive services or local healthcare systems as well to help people navigate the system more easily, because it's complicated often to find the right care at the right time, and we want to get rid of that complexity. So that's an overview of the Unmind platform. There's also a mood diary that you can use to check in. So there's quite a lot of different things. It's designed for a diverse population of people and making sure there's something for everyone.
And do you take a view that do you, because there's a lot there that people could interact with, there's a lot of different things, and do you sort of leave people to sort of move through it as they might wish to after they've done their index, and you sort of signpost them, or is there a guided way through it, or not so much?
It's a mix. There's different user personas that we have, and some people will be guided on particular journeys, others will be quite self-guiding of their own journey.
Okay. And I know that one of the big ethoses within Unmind, and you just mentioned it there, is around measuring efficacy. So how do you go about measuring the efficacy of whether it's the series or whether it's the app in general, or how have you done that?
The purpose of Unmind is not to perpetually be improving somebody's mental health. The reality is, someone could on Friday do an Unmind index, on Saturday win the national lottery, and on Monday do the Unmind index, and their scores could massively go up. And we could say, well, isn't Unmind a brilliant platform?
Right.
Equally, somebody on Friday could do the Unmind index, and on Saturday lose a loved one, and then on Monday do it again. And you could say, well, Unmind's a dreadful platform. That's not the point. The point of the Unmind index is to give people an understanding of how they're doing with their mental health, because that empowers them to then think, well, that area needs a bit of work, I'll focus on that. So that's the purpose of the index, and making sure that's scientifically rigorous. So we have a peer-reviewed paper being published in the near future, demonstrating the efficacy of that as an assessment tool. And so very excited about that. Validating is a gold standard measure. Yeah, very exciting. But then with each of the individual series on the platform, depending on what the series is doing, we also have measurement around that to demonstrate whether or not it's increasing people's awareness and understanding of the topic. Is it helping? Let's say it's a series around lifting your mood. Is it actually effective? Is it actually doing that? And we have our own in-house science and research team constantly reviewing and assessing the efficacy of what we're doing. And also we have formal collaborations with a number of leading universities to do independent research on the platform as well. Measurement is so important, and it's key that the preventative world of mental health is as scientifically rigorous as the reactive end of the mental health service provision as well.
And what are the things what are the, well, maybe metrics is the wrong word, but how are employers valuing Unmind's impact on their workforce?
So Unmind, we define ourselves to organizations as a workplace mental health platform, and we bring value in two ways. The first is that we empower the employees to manage the mental health in the way that we've just been discussing. The second is that we aggregate and anonymize, and that anonymity is key, the data from the platform into a dashboard so that organizations get unprecedented insight into how their people are. And using that data, that allows them then to make informed strategic investments in the well-being of their people in a way that they've never been able to before, because traditional data that organizations have around the mental wellness of their people is based on access of employee assistance programs, access to private medical care if that's available, absenteeism data. That data is either scarce or highly unreliable, and is not very valuable when you're trying to make a strategic investment for the 5 in 5, not the 1 in 5. So Unmind really helps organizations to become more data informed as they drive their mental health agendas and wellbeing agendas.
That makes sense, because I can imagine otherwise, they might in the past have done a, employee satisfaction survey once in a while or something, and half of people might not have filled it out or whatever, but with Unmind, it gives them access to an aggregated, anonymized set of all of the data from everyone that's using it over quite a large period of time, which is way more insightful.
Absolutely.
Cool. And what dealing with the pandemic specifically, has there been any shift in what employees using Unmind are concerned about? Have you seen any trends? What I know you released recently your report around that said 65% of employers are concerned about the impacts of COVID on negatively impacting their business, but via mental health issues through their employees. So what have you seen in that regard?
Yeah, so again, coming back to that whole person idea of mental health, think about the impact of the health pandemic on biological parts of someone's life, or the physical parts of someone's life. They're really profound. It's limited our ability to go out and exercise. It's limited our ability to move as much, and therefore it's limited our ability to sleep as well. Right. Our diets have changed because we're eating in different places at different times.
Sure.
If you look at our psychological life, we're under constant threat. We've lost control of our environment. These are things which are known to be predictors of stress and burnout, etc. If you look at our social life, we've lost the ability to meet people in person. Our finances have changed. Either we might be on furlough, we might have lost our jobs. Our loved ones might be ill or unwell. So basically, that whole person model of understanding mental health, it's under enormous pressure and threat. So unsurprisingly, the prevalence of mental ill health has increased in groups within society. People are not sleeping as well. Typical things you might expect to see. There are some also more positive trends, such as a sense of connection when the first kind of when the pandemic first hit, increased on the Unmind index, which I think is fascinating. People felt that sense of connection to one another.
Yeah,
I
we're in
certainly
this
on a
together.
personal level felt that. We're in this together, exactly.
Yeah.
But following the data has been very interesting. Certainly from an uptake perspective and engagement perspective, we really noticed that as well, as you would expect.
Yeah. Cool. And when you started the business 5 years ago, what were the biggest kind of pushbacks or obstacles that you found when you were going out talking to employers about what you were trying to do or what you were doing? And how has that changed to now? So I know it must be a very different environment now.
I think, if I'm honest, the biggest surprise isn't, or the biggest, when I look back on that period, my main memory is, or my main feeling about it is surprised that so many organizations were so willing to engage so quickly.
Okay.
It's that way around really than the other way around. But pushback we experienced included things like, our workforce don't do this, or we're already covered because we have an EAP, or there's no budget. Those were the kind of typical things that we might see. Now, I think digital preventative healthcare has gone from a nice to have novelty to a need to have an essential component of any decent wellbeing strategy.
Yeah, it seems that way. I mean, the uptake of your service, in the US and the UK and Australia would speak to that. But I also know that even more traditional health plans now seem to have some kind of mental health component in them and within workplaces. So yeah, it seems like the market's definitely moved. When you look at the service provision across the US, the UK and Australia, are there differences in how workplaces view these topics across those different markets? So, I mean, they're quite different in terms of healthcare provision and healthcare services, at their core. So what kind of differences are there in terms of viewing what you do?
I think there are differences, and I think the US is maybe a couple of years behind when it comes to prevention. And organizations are more still in the reactive mindset than the preventative mindset. But that is definitely changing. I remember going to a mental health workplace conference 4 years ago, and all of the presentations were on fascinating things, but things like the use of ketamine in treatment-resistant depression. And that was where the narrative was at. Fast forward to today, and that same conference is really all focused on prevention. And we're seeing that trickle down into the workplace. But the US has a very different model of purchasing benefits, the different ethos around the responsibility of the employer to the employee. Obviously a very different relationship to the notion of healthcare. And that informs how the US as a market operates. But we see all of the right trends, because I think there were two very significant macro trends going on this topic at the moment. The first is that obviously the prevalence of mental ill health is increasing, as we've discussed. The second macro trend, though, which is more positive, is that the stigma that has long held this topic back is lifting. And people are now more able and willing to speak about mental health in ways that we've not been able to for a very long time in societies. And that allows a more accepting environment to kind of plant the seed about the importance of prevention.
Yeah, and I would imagine within a workplace, that kind of more openness is really important to drive the engagement with the product and service.
I think that's right.
You don't want people to feel like they need to go and hide and use the app. You want people to, I assume, to be able to, were you on the Unmind thing today? Have you seen that thing on it? Yeah, I just did this series. I'm doing it on mindfulness, in the workplace. Why don't you check it out? I think it's really useful, sort of thing.
I think that's right. And we've seen over this period, particularly, we've seen CEOs of some of our biggest companies do webinars with me or speak publicly to their organization about what they're doing on the Unmind platform. Isn't that cool?
That's really cool. That's really cool.
A generation ago, the idea of getting a CEO to publicly talk about their mental health to their employees, that wouldn't have happened.
No, never happening.
So things are changing.
That's cool. And do you believe that they actually did they do use the app? That kind of thing. They do. It's not just a showpiece. They are actually engaging with it, sort of thing.
Oh, I absolutely think they're engaging in it and engaging in the notion of looking after themselves, because they recognize by doing so, they will ultimately be better to their company.
Yeah, they'll be more valuable to their company, and their staff will be performing more, I guess, more efficiently, because they'll want to be there, and they'll actually want to work for the person that they're working for, because they think the person they're working for is, nice or helpful, or, more aware and more conscious of their well-being.
Absolutely. Go back to the dental thing again. Like, it's
Right.
like, can you imagine as an organization if you found out that all your employees weren't brushing their teeth?
Yeah,
That would be quite surprising, wouldn't it?
I would be surprised.
I'd be surprised. I'd be a bit alarmed.
Yeah.
And I think we moved forward in the workplace towards gyms, or towards the idea that people exercise. Many people now expect to shower in the workplace. They'll run to the workplace, or they'll cycle to the workplace, or organizations to do challenges where you count your number of steps, because we really want people to be looking after their physical health. Now what we're seeing is this third wave of actually organizations saying, and we also really want you to prioritize looking after your minds, because they are critical. If you really think about organizations, the benefit they get from encouraging their employees to be proactive about their mental health, they get a better reputation because of the way they're looking after their people. They have a better culture because their people are well.
Because everyone's happy.
Exactly. And then as a result, they'll have the competitive advantage. It's a total no-brainer. It's really important that we demonstrate the value that prevention can bring to the workplace. But I don't think there's anyone that doesn't intuitively get it as well.
Yeah. And so, okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So one question is, you mentioned right at the beginning of the show a word that I'm not sure our listeners necessarily would have understood, but presenteeism. Absenteeism, I think everyone understands, but what exactly is presenteeism?
Well, presenteeism is being present in the workplace with a problem.
Okay.
I spoke to a good friend of mine recently who really high-flying person going through a house move at the moment, and he said, I can hardly concentrate on my work because I'm so focused on the house move. That's a great example of being present at work physically, but not actually being able to work because you're thinking about something else. It's the same principle. If you're coming into work but you're burnt out, if you're coming into work but you've got crippling anxiety, it's going to impact on your ability to perform in that workplace, irrespective of whether you're physically there, or I mean in today's world, digitally there, but you're not really there in person. You want your people to be able to come in and be super focused and engaged. It's basically like presenteeism results in disengagement despite physically being there.
Then I imagine in certain that, I know you work with BA and a number of other people, but in certain roles, being that presenteeism could be actually quite dangerous to yourself, depending upon what you're actually doing.
That's definitely true. Yeah, that's it. That's definitely true. It results on all your decisions.
Yeah, because it prevents you from thinking clearly. So then the next question I have is, you mentioned it also a little bit, which was when someone is using the app, or if someone uses the app and it appears that they need more help, more down the diagnostic pathway, potentially, how does that surface within the app, and how do you sort of look after that person and make sure they kind of get to where they need to get to? How does that get dealt with?
So based on your scores, if your Unmind index scores are elevated in a particular area that indicates that you might get value from additional support, the platform will automatically say, look, this score is low. You might find, it might be a case we say, look, you might find this content useful to you, but also you might find a useful resource in this, and then you can link through to that page. It ultimately then becomes the individual's choice as to whether they choose to do that. Because again, the last thing an employee wants is to think that by touching the Unmind platform, they might accidentally press a button that then alerts some higher power that they need support. So it's got to be, do you know what I mean? It's got to be the choice of the individual to want to access that care. But also that's the reality of healthcare. There's old jokes like, how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is, it depends if the light bulb wants to be changed. That you've got to need the person to want the change in order for that to be effective. And if they want the change, they need to reach out.
And I could imagine, thinking about it from an employee's perspective again, if the platform becomes too sort of pushy in a sense, that's going to sort of move people away from it. That's right. Sort of suspect. That's so right. What's next for Unmind in the next 12, 24 months?
I'm incredibly excited about what we're doing. Ultimately, for us, the vision of the company is a world where mental health is universally understood, nurtured, and celebrated. And every day, it's that idea that gets us out of bed in the morning and gets us into work. The team is growing fast at the moment, so more and more brilliant minds coming in to help us build the platform in an ever more sophisticated way. So we're putting a huge amount of investment into the complexity of the platform, into the user experience, into the content, into the science, and expanding our teams to reach ever more people with the client success team, working more closely with organizations to amplify the message out, with our marketing teams, and with ultimately our growth teams as well, reaching more and more clients. So in every area of the business, we're expanding, and we have a kind of an ambitious 18 months ahead.
That's good. And will there be more countries on the plan, or will it be about scaling in the US, the UK, and Australia, where you already kind of have a solid base?
Well, the platform is live in 115 countries, but currently in English. So we'll be expanding to be in ever more countries and in regional languages as well.
Wow, 115 countries. So that means that is that because you're working with global companies who have employees everywhere effectively, then they can access it that way? Okay. Yep. Wow. So, I think that would be fantastic. That is quite a lot of work, though, to translate it into all of those languages. But I think that's.
Well, I think it won't be all of those languages. We're one at a time. But that's right. It's an incredibly exciting thing to be able to ensure that people get the right care at the right time for their mental health, and really driving that preventative message that prevention is better than cure. And we as a generation have an opportunity as innovators in healthcare to transform how people relate to the topic of mental health. And it is, like you say, a huge amount of work. It's a big task ahead of us.
Good. Well, I think on that note, Nick, I want to say thanks a lot for coming on the show and telling us all about Unmind. I think what you're doing is fantastic. And it seems like you are, on a rocket ship, but it's doing something that's extremely valuable for us all. And, I think that the companies that are using your service, using Unmind service, their employees are very lucky to have access to that. So, I wish you all the best as you add languages and add countries and add services. So yeah, thanks a lot for coming on the show. And thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's been great talking to a kindred spirit on the journey, and hearing about what you're doing as well. So thank you so much.
No problem. Have a good day.